Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Diane Rehm Book Club. It is my pleasure to welcome you here. I am Leslie Van Zandt, WAMU's Chief Advancement Officer. Thank you so much for joining us. First, a few housekeeping things to go through. If you would like to ask a question, please do so using the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to access closed captioning for this broadcast, you can do so by pressing the closed captioning on your screen. And this edition of the Diane Rehm Book Club, like all of our programs here at WAMU, are brought to you by your support. And we appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate you giving to the station. You can do so by visiting dianerehm.org at your convenience. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and your host, Diane Rehm. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And to all of you, welcome to the October meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club. This month's selection is The Unsettled by Ayana Mathis. Set in the 1980s, the novel tells the story of 3 generations of a Black family marked by trauma and their struggles to find a sense of safety and home. Joining me for our discussion, Soyica Colbert, professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University and author of Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Certainly. J.T. Roane, assistant professor of Africana Studies at Rutgers University and author of Dark Agoras.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Pardon me, and Marion Winik, professor of creative writing at the University of Baltimore and host of the Weekly Reader podcast. Thank you, Marion, for joining us.
Great to be here.
And we'll be taking your questions throughout our discussion. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I promise you we'll try to get to as many as we can. Well, I have to tell you, Soyica, this book titled The Unsettled made me as unsettled as I think I've ever been reading a book. At first, I I read the book once and I put it down and I thought, I can't read this again. I just cannot. And then I did. And I'm so glad I did, because I learned so much from this book about our country, about Philadelphia in those times. I knew when I read that first page where Toussaint is talking that it was Philadelphia in the era of move. Tell us about that era and what Ayana is writing about.
So the title, I agree with you, it resonates on so many different levels. I grew up in New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia, and remember my parents' shock and horror when they saw the newspaper headlines around move, particularly since Mayor Good was the first Black mayor of the city of Philadelphia. And one of the things that the novel helps us to think about is both how the 1980s is an outgrowth of a longer history of settler colonialism, and linking both the protagonists back to a freed town in Alabama right after Reconstruction, but then also I think the longing for a more expansive community formation out stemming from the civil rights movement and Black power. And so if we understand the civil rights movement and Black power as these iconic historical moments that expanded the care for Black folks in the United States, then the novel helps us to think through how do we get to the 1980s, where there seems to be so much precarity and lack of a social safety net for Black people in particular, and Americans more generally. And the novel both unsettles us and the unfinished business of both what the civil rights movement and Reconstruction were trying to achieve. And it also draws our attention to how folks, Black folks in particular, remain unsettled within the context of the United States.
Indeed. Marion, what was your reaction?
To the title in particular?
To the book in general.
Well, I was, I had also read the 12 Tribes of Hattie, and I was prepared for, another intense, dark, courageous kind of in your face book that shows, the situation of Black people. And that is what I found. What I felt, I really loved the stories, the narrative structure, moving back and forth between the portions that follow the main character in Philadelphia and the other sections that are set in Bonaparte, Alabama, where she comes from. And that those two sections are quite different and told in totally different voices. And I felt like that really made the novel fun to read, in as much as it could be fun given the darkness of the topic.
It is very dark, is it not, JT?
Sure, yes. And I think I do think that it unsettles in ways that are meaningful for writing about, especially the 1980s in the Philadelphia context. I think I agree, with Soyica around the ways that Black communities continue to remain unsettled, right? Through the kind of serial displacements that the book brings into view. And I think even though Bonaparte, the part that takes place in a rural Alabama town, is out of a tradition and a legacy of Black free space post-emancipation, and does, really emerge from a kind of resistance to slavery, we also still see the ways that through its ongoing relationship with an adjoining white town, which is very aggressive, but also the ways that even as folks migrate and leave from that area, that history follows them into a place like Philadelphia. And the ways that it shows up, especially in the repression of Black power, as Soyica was underscoring, and the kind of slow violence of the 1980s, where there is the eventful, and we could talk, I'm sure, more about that, but also the kinds of less eventful ways that Black communities are forced to suffer, 100,000 industrial jobs leaving the city, as well as, the kind of state retrenchment around support for just everyday infrastructures of living in a place like Philadelphia, and the cost of that, right? So I think, yes, I agree. It left us unsettled, but I appreciate that. I don't think at this point we can have histories or novels or narratives about the 1980s that leave us comfortable without jeopardizing our critical need to really engage that moment differently.
I was really impressed with the understanding of towns, small historic Black towns like Bonaparte, which we learn about through the main character, Ava. Her mother, Duchess, continues to live in Bonaparte and is fighting off white development. She says early in her own narrative, and that is a personal narrative, that white people progress, as it's known, have undermined the ownership of Black land in that area. How did they manage to do that, Soyica? And was that done in other areas of the country as well?
Absolutely. I mean, it's through a slow series of encroachments, as JT mentioned, and it's through both legal and extra legal means. And so one of the fascinating and horrifying aspects of the history of Black home ownership and land ownership in the US is that you see the inversion of the systems of law taking shape such that Black people get dispossessed. And so I was recently just reading and writing about this Black man who bought a home in Westchester County in New York in the 1950s, and all of the legal and extra legal means his neighbors took to try to push him out, from burning crosses on his lawn to his lender consistently saying that he had not received the monthly payment from the mortgage, to the point where the homeowner had to physically take his check to the lender every month. And all of these means. And so Bonaparte obviously is taking place in an earlier time period. But I guess the point that I would make is that you see Black people actively participating in what America claims as its rights for participation. And when they do, there are all of these barriers that are put in place to diminish their ability to participate. And so you buy land, you buy a house, you pay your taxes, you do what you're purportedly supposed to do, and then the rules change. And so that slow encroachment is seen in Bonaparte. But the thing that I also found fascinating about what JT said is that social context travels with Ava to Philadelphia, that history goes with her. And so there's a clear connection between the shrinking of possibility that's happening in Bonaparte in the novel and the shrinking possibilities of what one can imagine for a commune or communal space in Philadelphia.
And Marion, here is where Ava, Duchess's daughter, leaves Bonaparte, as Soyica says, because the opportunities there are truly non-existent. She has a son once she moves, and that son, Toussaint, tells a lot of the story in such small but important ways. I loved his character. What was your thought about him?
Well, I mean, he's the light of Ava's life. and her and it's what he's her reason to keep going. As the book opens, she's just left an abusive man in New Jersey and come into Philly and is seeking a place to stay at a homeless center. And they get these really grubby, awful accommodations, and she's so horrified for her son to have to stay there. And I think Toussaint is the character that brings Ava's emotional life into the picture. And yeah, he's very lively. Later, once they get into the commune, his experience is what the reader experiences as well of what the way this place is. I wanted to mention that, like Soyica, I grew up in New Jersey at the same time in the 1980s, and also was very aware of MOVE. And as I read the book, I didn't know going into the book that it was like historical fiction based on this real situation. And I kept, thinking, wait, this is MOVE. Isn't this MOVE?
Yeah.
And then I looked it up in Wikipedia, and sure enough, it was, all the details, especially of the big conflagration and everything that happens later in the book, are just like what really did happen. And I thought it was a fascinating combination, a fascinating work of historical fiction in this way, that so much of that part is real, and yet these characters are invented.
Well, fire and flame seems to be very present in this novel, JT, because they're in Bonaparte, the central grocery store, the grocery store that entire community depends on, is burnt to the ground as an act, we assume, of hostility by the encroaching progress group of white builders, white developers who want any and all of the residents of Bonaparte to leave. So we have that symbol early on in the novel, and it leaves fewer and fewer people there in Bonaparte because they're frightened. They know that their lives are truly in danger. This isn't the only place that happened. I think the situation which happened in the 1920s in Oklahoma, where an entire city built by and for middle-class, hardworking, fairly well-to-do Blacks, was burned to the ground because the white people wanted them out. Did you find yourself thinking about them as well?
Yes, I think for sure the kind of encroachment that the town Bodine and then this new housing kind of formation through developers called Progress, it plays on a kind of ongoing script in relation to, especially in the South, but as Soyica's example points to, not exclusively and often in intensified ways in places like Chicago, as your work points to through Hansberry and others. But I think this is, I'm reminded of Danielle Purifoy, geographer, and Louise Seamster's work around the historical nature of what is often termed white towns really emerging out of plantation geographies and ecologies, and really always having had a kind of, especially in the post-emancipation period, a very intensive relationship of often of land theft in relation to Black communities. And we can think about the Sea Islands and the kind of encroachment of tourism. We can think about the eventful displacements of people following the kind of unnatural disaster, Hurricane Katrina. We can think about all the moments at which either through outright force or other means, Black places, semi-autonomous or autonomous Black communities have been absorbed violently into their white proximate counterparts. And I think that is really what's drawn out here. And I think I think especially the kind of firing, the use of fire in that context, and its reversal, which we could talk about. We could talk about the other characters' use of fire in relation to burning back progress at a certain point and the complexities of that. But I think that kind of it certainly resonates with Tulsa. It certainly resonates with many communities where lynchings and other things were used to very, very early after emancipation in certain contexts. Like my own home community in the Tidewater, Virginia, it's used in the areas where Black communities have basically built independent towns using their own small scale agricultural production and oyster production in particular. It's not necessarily fire that's used, but lynching, right? That helps to precipitate and make quicker kind of especially after the turn of the 20th century, but especially after 1920, Black land loss, this loss in general, again, to larger, and I think that extends up to now in relation to both housing development, but also the kind of rural land buying up that's happening in relation to supposed green futures, right? Rural communities in the US and beyond are being, Black senses of place are being dissolved for large tree plantations and other things that are tied to that. So thank you.
Marion, you want to comment?
I'm not sure that I have anything to say about that, except that it's fascinating, and it's really interesting to hear about the ways that the novel reflects different historical realities.
Soyica, what about Ava in her role as mother?
So I had a deep sense of sympathy, compassion, frustration with Ava. I think that the complexity of all the characters makes the novel one of the best assets of a really great novel. And for me, there were moments that resonated and demonstrated her complexity throughout. But in the opening sequence that Marion described, where Ava first moves to the homeless shelter with Toussaint, you have this clear awareness that she feels like she's separate from the other residents living there, that they don't belong there, that she does not want to understand herself as being homeless, which is its own psychological twist. And then later on in the novel, you have Toussaint identifying with these men who are living in an encampment. And he says something like, they don't have things, I don't have things, so what's the difference? Even as he's processing the fact that he's supposed to look down on them. And so following Ava's trajectory is really powerful, because you see also how she shifts and changes. After it seems like she suffers a concussion, when she's fading in and out of consciousness, after domestic abuse with her ex-husband, and how that impacts her relationship with Toussaint. And so all of this is interwoven with the primary fact that the systems that are supposed to be there to support her are falling short in every measure. And so even her ability to gain access to housing is really a very base level of care that the city is able to offer and the state is able to offer. And so my impressions of her as a character are interwoven with my general sadness about the state of affairs in Philadelphia and larger US cities in the United States in the 1980s, but then also really the breaking apart of social networks that emerges after the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement.
When you said you were frustrated with her, I was wondering, did your frustration come out of I felt most frustrated with her in her relationship with Cass, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered what you thought.
Yeah. I mean, I was frustrated with her in a relationship with Cass. I was curious about how she was able to be so not controlling is the wrong word, but how she was able to be so steadfast while she was in the shelter and then seemingly give herself over to Cass. But I was also frustrated with her, and I knew it was an outgrowth of her circumstance, but I was frustrated with her because she was unable to attend to Tucson even before they moved to live with Cass.
It's true. But the manner in which she was treated, Marion, at that shelter just was horrific. The director, who was supposed to be there to, quote, help her, did nothing but demean her, keep after her.
Literally just, she was a snob. I mean, we were seeing inside her head, and she was thinking, really judgmental thoughts that didn't show any like awareness that you would expect from a person whose background is in social work. But, I think it was a combination of the times of the 80s, but also this character was a particularly bad character.
And when
Ava's relationships with men just, they continued to mess up. I mean, she gets involved with that guy, Melvin,
at the shelter.
Yeah. And that was, I think ever since Ava witnessed the shooting death of her father, it seems like she has been looking for some kind of replacement of this male center in her life. Her father was a great, great guy and a big hero of the town, and a really wonderful person that was literally shot before her eyes. And that is when Ava's mother started to, when Duchess really lost her grip on mothering and became such a lousy mother that Ava just basically drifted away from her. But anyway, I think that there's some possibility that this wonderful male energy that she had in her life with her father is something that she really craves and wants to get back, but seems to, and she wants to think that maybe Cass is the kind of man her father was.
And she wants to think it, but I must say the men in this novel, JT, the guard at the shelter, Cass, as we've already said, and Ava's first husband, who threw her out the house. Everything she owned was virtually lost except for her son, Tucson. She experiences a terrible injury to her head, which, as Soyica says, perhaps caused a concussion. It really sounded to me as though she had a concussion, but yet she sees Cass as this heroic figure until the very end, when she recognizes that things had gone really wrong. But back to this woman who is supposed to be giving her help at the shelter. I mean, she sends her off on this big interview, and her face is all bruised. And somehow the woman who sends her off hardly even notices that she's been damaged, that she's been hurt so badly. And then she can hardly answer questions when she goes to this job interview. It really, really put her down and took her deeper into her own depression, JT, and took her farther and farther and farther away from Tucson.
Yes. I think I think that's part of the brilliance of this work. It is exactly the ways that through Ava's relationships and also her triangulation with some of the other characters, we get this really rich and complex profile of the ways that trauma, again, out from the long shadow of slavery, really shape people's everyday existences. And I think part of how we get the narrative, the way that it weaves back and forth between these two places, but also the way that it weaves between the various characters throughout, it gives us a real profile of what it of what where the state and where other entities meet working class and poor Black people at a particular juncture in the 80s. And I think it's important to note that I mentioned this before, but Philadelphia loses about 100,000 jobs between 1970 and 1980. And that's matched after 1981 with austerity, with federally enforced housing austerity that really limited housing choices of all kinds. There was major pushback against this in that context. And I think, the squatters movement in Philadelphia and other organized efforts to reclaim housing that was being increasingly sort of held at a distance from Black communities' basic levels of access. So I think we also get, the reality is that many of our cities, the workforce of the structure itself depends on poverty as an industry. So I think when we think about a place like Philadelphia, a significant portion, I don't have the numbers, but a significant portion of people make their living through a management relationship with poor people, right? With people who are dehoused, with all these kinds of things. So the very architecture of the post-industrial city is based on a need for a certain kind of population that is not at work. And I think we get a sense too of the kind of workfare, the violence of welfare workfare through Ava's movement. Literally, the woman doesn't see that she's been hit, that she's suffered this abuse, but also she's going to, the other part of that violence is she's going to job training and job, being pushed like so many recipients into job training and jobs that don't and will never exist in this period. So that's also part of the kind of violence. And I think that Mathis really does hold us to account and makes us unsettled about the ways that patriarchal violence shapes people's lives, especially in this case of women and children. But I also see that in the juxtaposition of Toussaint and these other men, we see another less sort of centered narrative of becoming, because we see Toussaint as in innocence, as a kind of young person, but we see other men who are being shaped by the same forces, who end up like Cass is his actual biological father. So we see that again, we get a very centered, rightfully centered narrative on Ava and her mother and other experiences. But I think we're also getting the ways that violence shapes interpersonal violence.
Exactly.
The violence of the state shapes those formulations.
Indeed.
Also really is, I mean, Cass is a very warped character. He is a con man, and he pulls a giant long con on the whole, in the book. He's terrible. I guess he has a messiah complex, that kind of leads
it's a good way to put it. I agree with you.
So he's really, he's not exactly a positive character, but
it's interesting because I think that Cass to me reminds me of a monarch. And so in other contexts in our society, that type of figuration would be held up as an ideal, like someone who is a visionary, wants to create his own community, is trying to provide healthcare, however misguided, to folks who don't have access to it. And I think within the context of a patriarchal society, a desire to align oneself with that is understandable, even if we perceive it as misguided. And so there are parts of Cass that to me make sense for why Ava is attracted to him. particularly because in many ways, she's constantly trying to replicate her experiences, as you said before, in Bonaparte in this new context. And so this idea of living communally and the opportunity to do so is something that she's familiar with independently with self-determination. It's something she's familiar with, and Cass provides an avenue to do that.
I also if I could, I jump in and say that Cass is also shaped by two specific violent moments. He's a Panther, and Mathis references the 1971 strip searching of the Panthers by Rizzo in Philadelphia as a point of departure from forecast for this other kind of venture that he has in mind that builds out community power through a kind of 10-point program based in the Panthers. The other moment that shapes his authoritarian capacity is the violent police raid that leaves him ostensibly, I guess, in the kind of novel dead, right? Or at least, I think that's his overall trajectory. And I think Cass has a certain, and I think we have to understand the histories of, I'm thinking here with Erica Edwards' work, the histories of charismatic authority and power have in Black worlds in the U.S. context have always been shaped by external violence. It's you have radically democratic institutions that, in the face of Jim Crow's encroachment, they're realigned around singular masculine figures. So I think so, and I'm thinking about Black churches and Elsa Barkley Brown and other folks' work around that. But I think Cass kind of warping as this authoritarian, charismatic figure is only possible with his own experiences as well. And I rightfully, those are not the ones that are centered in the kind of narrative unfolding, but we do get evidence of where the state is also pressuring these patriarchal visions, and where that erupts into violent forms of trying to control others.
Well, and going back to your point, Marion, he is a true con man, using those techniques that have come from his background, going to Bonaparte and using a whole different name and identity, and helping those few remaining residents of Bonaparte, mending fences, literally mending fences, constructing or reconstructing needed facilities, and then creating fire.
But why do you think he does it? Like, why does he? So he's already had a relationship with Ava. They've had a kid, and then he goes down to her hometown and introduces himself as a completely other person, not he knows his actual relationship to Duchess, that he's, I don't understand. I mean, I just want to know what other people think about, why does he do this scam of his?
Because, I mean, this is my answer. He has heard from Ava about this parcel of land that her mother owns, has title to, and perhaps he sees this in a visionary way as a place to establish this new kingdom for himself and for his followers. What do you think, Soyica?
No, I agree. I think that he believes his vision. And the part that makes me think that he's not acting only selfishly is that whether the land was titled to him or to Ava, ultimately, presumably, it would become Toussaint's land. Right. And so it's not as if he's trying to work around what we understand as the inheritance. In that way, I think that he actually believes in his vision, and he sees Ava and her mother's land as the avenue to achieve that vision.
But another character I'd like to ask you about is the young Episcopal priest who becomes Toussaint's savior in a way. She is a white woman. She gives out food to the young people in the neighborhood. She ultimately becomes someone Toussaint turns to because he's hungry, he's lonely, he's confused, he doesn't know why things are changing and changing for the worse after that first police raid. He's really lost. Without her, she really becomes a force of goodness in his life, Marion, don't you think?
I do. I mean, and I'm happy that there's, considering that there's so few white characters in the book, and most of them are horrible, and and realistically so. But she's is a different angle, and it is a hopeful angle that somebody could be like her, and there's a big emphasis on the food sharing in those scenes, because Toussaint has really been hungry for a while, and even in the commune, they're not really, there's a lot of hunger is a theme in the book, and not being satisfied. And she has I think, as I recall, she has all kinds of like junk food kind of in bulk, and
which the kids love.
Right. Yeah. But so she's very literally feeding him, and I mean,
and providing
one non-devil character.
Indeed, and providing ultimately a connection to his grandmother, which I think was so incredibly important. So you can talk about that connection that was made.
Yeah, the facilitation of the letters is key, both in Duchess realizing that she has a grandson, which, by the end of the novel, the novel's bookended with Toussaint trying to figure out how he's going to get to Bonaparte, and then, Duchess, in some ways, holding out hope that he will come to Bonaparte. And the reason why she is continuing to invest in this possibility is because she's made aware that he is alive, and that he from the letters. And then that's when she puts the pieces together of the land theft, when she gets the notification and all the rest. And so I think that the relationship is important. I also think that one of the key distinctive points here, and this goes back to the question about, the representation of white characters in the novel, I think it's important that she's affiliated with a religious organization and not the state. Because again, I think part of what the novel is trying to establish is that many of the communal organizations that we normally would have turned to for support, let's say in the 50s, have now been disinvested in by community members and elsewhere. So they're not available to white or Black folks by the 1980s. And at the same time, the state modes of care that were available in the 60s and 70s also have been retracted. And so you're in this space, this no man's land of not having care societies anymore at the same volume you had in the 40s and the 50s. And you also don't have a state to rely on as a safety net. And so much of the violence that is incurred by white folks on Black folks in the novel is, at least in Philadelphia, we often see these police raids, the welfare system, being articulated through state means. So I do think that that's also an important aspect to thinking about where she's positioned communally.
I've just been asked, perhaps by a number of people in our audience, why I assumed that the Episcopal priest was white. Did you all make that assumption, or was that just mine?
I didn't think that she was. I didn't, and
You
I think
thought she was Black.
I thought she was Black, and part of it, perhaps if I did miss a detail, was about the parallels with Father Paul Washington in the MOVE context. The the Church of the Advocates' kind of central role in trying to, especially in the 78 conflict, negotiate a settlement between the city and move that could resolve without violence. So maybe that was my misreading in just importing the details from
Do you
someone
think
like
it
Paul
was meant?
Washington. But
Do you think it was left as ambiguous, or do you, Soyica, think she was Black?
I'm not sure whether she's Black or white. When you asked the question, it made me rethink. Maybe I had misread it.
Me
So
too.
I'm not sure.
Marion, you and I both thought she
I don't
was
know.
white.
I was kind of playing off you saying this, and I guess I didn't have a strong opinion on what she was. I'm looking now. I know she's kind of gender fluid.
Yeah.
Right. She goes by Pastor Phil, and it says Pastor Phil was hardly a girl at all. I'm looking in the book right now. I'll tell you what I find.
Okay, a number of people say
Well, there's
Pastor
probably
Phil is Black. Say it, Marion.
I mean, I'm going to see if I can find anything. That...
Okay. David in our audience says he just checked the book and says she's Black.
Okay.
It's described as having a short afro. Well,
Okay.
that could mean...
Well, that was the one nice white character. Too bad.
Yeah, well, you never know. I must say,
Clear that up.
I have a...
Otherwise, she would have been a white savior, and then that would never have worked.
Here's a question from Jack, who says, I'm from Philadelphia and remember the MOVE bombing, but it seems like people from other places have never heard of it. Do you think that's true, Soyica?
I wouldn't be surprised by that. And I guess it would also depend on who you were talking to generationally. So I currently teach at Georgetown University, and I would be surprised if any of my students knew about the MOVE bombing. So I think it depends on generation, but and geographic specificity. But since I grew up outside of Philadelphia, it's very resonant for me. But I wouldn't be surprised if folks who grew up in other geographies weren't as familiar.
How closely do you think the attack in Mathis' book adheres to what really happened in Philadelphia? Soyica.
When I was reading it, I mean, similar to Marion, I was thinking the whole time this is MOVE, but I think JT probably could answer that question more about the the one-to-one historical context. But to me, just reading it and remembering the newspaper coverage, it was very similar.
Oh, me too. Go ahead, JT.
Yeah, I think it combines some elements of the 78, the conflict as it culminates in 78 with the police raid on the first MOVE headquarters and the 85 bombing. And I think, again, that's why I underscore the kind of brilliance of this book is I think when you look at the profile, I've been looking at the profile of the 85 bombing, of course, the unique situation where the FBI field agents give the Philadelphia Police Department unsanctioned plastic explosives and then they deploy it is a very distinctive situation. But I think when you look at the profile of deaths, it really is this kind of slow quotidian form that makes something as tragic as MOVE possible. In the 1980s, it's nearly impossible to go a couple of weeks in Philadelphia without a major fire, for example, often due to faulty wiring or poorly maintained rental structures. So I think that what Mathis is doing is playing with all of this, but I think MOVE is distinctive from the arc in key ways as well. Of course, the arc is not as centrally religious. Although there are certain kinds of religious formulations that begin to be articulated as part of their thought, but I think in a day-to-day way, MOVE understood and understands what their practices are in relation to the city as part of their religious identity and part of their and part of their unique understanding of theology. So I think that departs. I also think that most of the kind of the elements of the kind of the violent attack are like, of course, they read closely with Move, but again, I think it's a complicated profile that shows the kind of ways that Mathis is using fiction to amplify what happened rather than a kind of skew details, if that makes sense. So I think in that sense, she's using fiction in a way to really bring our attention to back to Move, even as she's not naming that as Move. That makes sense.
That first attack on the Ark really undid everybody. Undid Cass, undid Zeke, undid Toussaint, everybody. It was as though everything that had gone before, the sort of normalcy that Cass had managed to create, began to dissipate. The neighbors began to become more suspicious. And then the question became, where was all this medication coming from that Cass was using to treat neighbors? Who had initially welcomed the Ark and welcomed the kind of caring environment that the Ark had created for the neighborhood? Why was that first attack so such an important event in the life and death of the Ark, Soyica?
I think that it drew the community's attention to the Ark being a source of unwanted surveillance and potential violence. And so while the community members could understand the benefits of the Ark, the cost-benefit analysis shifts drastically. And at the same time, the members of the Ark, the adults for at least, their psychological state shifts really drastically because of the violence that they witness and that is exhibited upon them. And so you see Cass going into sort of this manic state of preparing to move from Philadelphia, Ava further retreating into herself. It has a detrimental effect on the adults and the children living within the Ark, and it also shifts the calculus for the community of what it means to have this commune among them.
Could I jump in and
Sure.
just say something very quickly? I think this parallels well the 78 and 85, the culmination in 78 and 85 of tensions between Move and their neighbors. And I think we can't take the growing tension with neighbors outside of the ongoing state surveillance and the kinds of effects that has, as well as the kind of violent regular arrest of Move members that drives in both situations, but especially in the 78 conflict. And I'll also just say that critical is Louis Messiah and Tony K. Bambara's film work in the aftermath of the 85 bombing. They really go through and interview folks whose name this bombing happened in, right? Is in the name of protecting these people from the Move folks that the state unleashes this violence. And none of those people had anticipated that the state could or would, first of all, kill Move members, the 11 Move members who perished, but also burn all of their houses to the ground.
Exactly, to burn all of it. But before that happens again, Marion, Ava withdraws from Toussaint, and he's found sort of on his own with just his couple of friends, and Ava, except when Cass is around, she's sort of gone numb again.
Really a very damaged woman, and I think at the end of the book, the hope is that Toussaint is going to reconnect with his grandmother, who somehow is, I think that's going to be such a great source for him to rebuild their family through that grandmother-grandson connection. While Ava, spends her time in jail, thinking about, the whole, what all these things that happened. I thought the ending was, had a real ray of hope in it, because the connection between the grandson and Duchess has been so well established and feels like such a positive direction, like the only positive thing that could come out of this disastrous, bloody nightmare.
But as we know, there toward the end, Toussaint is on his own, wandering the city, but with help from the pastor. He goes back to that burned down house as though he needs to feel the presence of his mother and his friends. He doesn't know where they are. His 2 or 3 friends have been taken into shelters where he has somehow escaped when his mother is taken to prison. I must say, it is a novel that stays with you, perhaps because of the reality on which it's based. The burnings, the shamings, the way Philadelphia treated that population. And to a certain extent, I mean, we're still getting episodes of this, still discussing the way police handle various encounters with Black Americans.
As I mentioned in my review, I live in Baltimore, and I reviewed the book for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And I was thinking that, both Baltimore and Minneapolis are cities that have been very recently scarred by police brutality against Black people. And so the book, it seemed kind of like, as a Baltimorean writing for Minneapolis people, I think that we all have a real connection to police violence.
And to the ways that we think about poverty and think about those who lost their work by no fault of their own. I mean, there Ava was living in her ex-husband's home, in her husband's home. And because Cass makes a visit, she is thrown out of her home to live a life that truly, truly was one of misery and difficulty. Any final thoughts on why people should read this book, Soyica?
I think the novel draws our attention to how the unsettling or the impact of settler colonialism should continue to make us unsettled as Americans and as readers more generally. And that the novel, although it does have the possibility for some hope at the end, it doesn't resolve the complex issues. And I think for me, that really resonates because it draws our attention to the work that still needs to be done.
Very briefly, JT.
Agree with Soyica. It leaves me unsettled, and I think we're, especially as we really deal with the full impact of what the 1980s means up to the present, but also the longer histories that precede that in relation to anti-Black violence. We need to remain unsettled, and this points in the way to that. Thank you.
And Marion.
Oh, and I just would add that Mathis's writing makes the book, in addition to all this important political point, it's a very rich fictional experience. And it's, her writing is what welcomes the reader into these two worlds of Philadelphia and Bonaparte. And, that's as important. That makes the message come through all the more clearly.
And makes us think about today's world, the world we are currently living in. Thank you so much, Marion Winik, J.T. Roane, and Soyica Diggs Colbert, for a very rich conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And in about 15 minutes, I'll be talking with Ayana Mathis about generational trauma, belief, and what literature can teach us about forgiveness. You can still register for that at the link in the chat. And thanks to all of you for being with us today. The next book club meeting will be on Wednesday, November 29th. The book is The House of Doors by Malaysian writer Tan Tuan Eng. It was longlisted for this year's Man Booker Prize. Finally, before you go, please do take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event. It's going to pop up on your screen. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Allie Dickman is our events director. Our engineer today is Kennedy Wright. We couldn't have been with you today without support of Leslie Van Sant, Carly Cloud, Lauren Centrella, Patrice Jackson, Render Silva, and Michelle Morgan. Thanks to all of them, and especially to all of you. I'll hope to see you in November. Thanks for being with us. I'm Diane Rehm.